In this video, we're going to carry on talking about the reign of Henry VII. We're moving on from the first part of the specification, where we looked in the previous videos at the consolidation of Henry Tudor's dynasty. We talked about the aims and the character of Henry VII, and we also talked about the establishment of the dynasty through examination of the various different pretenders to the throne and dynastic rebellions against his reign. The next section in the specification talks about the government of Henry VII. This refers to examination of the council, parliament, justice, royal finance, and domestic policies. This video specifically is going to begin with the first of these major elements of Henry's government. This is the council. Now, ultimately, we're going to look at the following topics in this lesson. We'll talk about the councils of Henry VII, which can be divided broadly into the Great Council on the one hand, and then the Council Learned in Law on the other hand. And then we will talk about his relationship with Parliament and his royal finances in future lessons' time. So, when we think about the government and the structure of government of Henry VII and the ways in which he related to his ministers, his councillors, and also his in relation to his finances, we have to keep in mind and keep in the back of our mind for the most part that Henry VII was particularly fragile in terms of his paranoia about people bringing dynastic threats to his throne. He is somebody who knows quite intimately well the fact that during the Wars of the Roses there were periods of relative stability, and that the death of a monarch leads to a further flaring up of conflict and tension. And so what he wanted to make sure was that his reign and that his dynasty would continue after his death. And so this idea of ensuring dynastic succession is something that is really striking at the heart of all of his decisions when it comes to his council, when it comes to the relationship he had with the nobility, when it comes to his personal finances, even when it comes to his foreign policy. So keep all of this in mind when we're talking about Henry VII's council. The council itself, in terms of its administrative functions, had the following different roles. So, firstly, they would advise the king, and this would be, of course, on issues and matters of government and the economy and foreign policy. They would also provide administrative features, so things like administration for the king, so administering the king's will on his behalf. They would also conclude legal judgment in cases. So this was partly also the legal system that existed. And so within the council, there were a number of councillors. The councillors within the council would be individuals who would come and go throughout the reign of Henry VII. Some councillors were members of Henry's nobility, and so they included the likes of, for example, Lord Dynham. Other councillors were not members of the nobility. In fact, for the most part, members of the nobility did not actually appear too much within the council. This is owing to Henry's general distrust of the nobility, because he knew that, again, rebellion, and whether these be rebellion on the basis of economic grounds or even on the basis of dynastic affairs, rebellions of these can actually crop up and can actually crop up from the nobility and from the power and influence, at least economic influence, that the nobility can have. So Henry was very distrustful of the nobility. He kept them at arm's length for a lot of the time, and this was reflected in his decisions and his conclusion to essentially keep the nobility out of the council as much as possible. Finally, though, there were laymen in the council, and these laymen would include the likes of members of the gentry, as well as a number of different legal professionals. If the council is going to be useful in the ability to conclude legal cases and to administer to essentially administer the realm on the behalf of the king, and to also advise the king on legal matters, of course, legal professionals would be welcome in such a institution. The most key members of the council, at least especially the part of the council that we'll get to in a second, the Council Learned in Law, was Sir Reginald Bray and Sir Edmund Dudley. Now, these would look at his finances and would actually be very instrumental in concluding quite predatory and quite hostile financial practices. And when we get to looking at Henry VII's practices, we'll get to looking at this in more detail. But he would as a conclusion to this basic overview of Reginald Bray and Edmund Dudley, they would both be executed in 1510 by Henry VIII. So you can understand just from that piece of information there, the kind of influence that they had over this particular area. They were particularly hostile and predatory in terms of the leeching of finances to try and ensure that Henry's treasury was as rich as humanly possible. When it comes to the internal workings of the council, the administration, throughout the reign of Henry VII, there were no real established rules relating to the procedure and operation. So there was not a specific set of bylaws, for example, on the internal workings and the internal affairs of the council itself. This was the case despite it being a permanent institution. So that's relatively unusual for as part of the general rules of the council. There are historical interpretations which suggest that the most influential people around Henry VII were actually not members of the council at all, which suggests that to an extent he would rely a lot less on the council than monarchs maybe before and after him. And this does track in terms of his influence, or people who influence him in terms of family members, which we'll get to in a second, but it also tracks in terms of his relationship with Parliament as well. Not only was he potentially somebody who kept the council at arm's length, but he was somebody that we know kept Parliament at arm's length for the majority of his reign. In fact, he would only call Parliament for reasons where he needed to call Parliament. He would never call Parliament if he didn't have to. Historian David Lodes, for example, argues that it was actually Lady Margaret Beaufort, who was the most influential influential voice in the ear of Henry VII. Of course, this was Henry VII's mother, and a number of other historians actually support this view, that to at least the greatest of extents, Lady Margaret Beaufort was actually very influential in the life of Henry VII. Okay, the extent to which she was influential in terms of being able to influence the council, or influence over the council, influence Henry instead of the council influencing Henry, is a debated matter. But at least in terms of her relationship with Henry, there was very much an influential voice in his ear at this time. The most controversial part of Henry's reign, and the most controversial part of the general government administration of Henry's reign, was the Council Learned in Law. This was the main offshoot of the council, and it was an institution that developed throughout Henry's reign, but it was actually mainly during the second half of his reign, where his general desire to ensure a dynasty became a general paranoia, as he became more and more obsessed with acquiring wealth and finances and stability, which came with it further ruthlessness in terms of actually being able to achieve his personal finances and his goals of personal financing. It was originally operated under the leadership of Reginald Bray, who met in the office of the Duchy of Lancaster. Now, the main function of the Council Learned in Law was simply one function, and one function only. This was the increase in Henry's revenue. According to historians, most modern historians that talk on this issue, the Council Learned in Law was actually a very deeply unpopular institution. It was seen as an institution which extracted money out of the king's subjects through a process which would bypass the ordinary legal processes. Now, even in the 1400s and the early 1500s, this was a controversial thing, because the concept of the king being able to leech off the taxes and to leech revenue out of his subjects was controversial even at the beginning of the Norman reigns, even in Anglo-Saxon England. So it was a particularly controversial element of Henry VII's reign as well. Following the death of Reginald Bray in 1503, the Council Learned in Law was actually operated by Sir Richard Empson and Edmund Dudley. these two became the key figureheads, and in fact became the key controversial characters in the council learned in law, and so would run the council until the death of Henry VII in 1509. And as I mentioned earlier on, they were both executed in 1510 by Henry VIII.